Okay, so today's daf is Samech Gimel. We're going to start at the top of the page with the second line, Ravina. So what we're talking about here is a little bit of a segue. The first Amud or so deals with the issue of Kevod Harav and the issue of giving Hora'ah, giving Psikat Halacha, deciding Halacha in the presence of one's Rav. So we talked about that yesterday. We started talking about the subject yesterday with regard to Halachot Pesukot. If there are Halachot that everybody knows what the conclusion is, what the ruling is it really controversial for the student to make it a ruling? And the answer is that basically, if in the eyes of the questioner, if in the eye of the questioner it's viewed as something novel, so then it's perceived as taking authority on the part of the student. So we say Ravina sar sakina beBavel. So Ravina would look at the knife in Bavel. What this means is that if a person was a shochet, the requirement was to show the knife to the chacham. The shochet doesn't necessarily have to be the Rav. He's not necessarily the posek. He's just doing his job as the shochet. So he had to show, as a matter of kavod, he had to show the knife to the Rav. So it says, so Rashi explains, Badak sakin latabach. So he would check the sakin, he would check the knife. And it says, "V'lo amru laharot sakin lachacham el mepnei kevodo shel chacham." Rashi says that the only reason why you show the sakin, the only reason why you show the knife to the chacham, it's not that the shochet can't check his own knife. It's because you're showing kavod to the chacham. V'nimtza Ravina notelo ateret kevod ha'ir. That what it shows you is that Ravina was taking a position of kavod, of big respect, even though Rav Ashim Rabo b'matam mechasya hava v'hi mibavel, and Rav Ashi was in a neighboring town. Okay, so the point here is that that Ravina was taking a position of authority by looking at the knife. Amar le Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi said to him, "Ma'ita ama avad marhachi." Why did you do this? Okay, in other words, Rav Ashi is his teacher, so he's saying, why did the master do this? Amar he said, "V'ha Rav Hamnuna orei b'charta d'argaz b'shnei Rav Chizda." Didn't we just learn that Rav Huna gave rulings in charta d'argaz in the years of Rav Chizda? Meaning, even though his teacher was alive, he still gave rulings. So even though my teacher is alive, I can look at the knife and take a position of kavod, saying that I am validating. I'm the authority validating the shechita, even though you're still alive. So Amar he said to him, Lav ore itmar. What it says was actually that he didn't give rulings in the time of his teacher. It doesn't say that he did, it said that he didn't. It said the opposite of what you're saying. In other words, that Rav Hamnuna, as long as his teacher was alive, he did not give any rulings. So Amar le itmar ore, ve'itmar lo ore. B'shnei de Rav Huna Rabbehu de la ore. Ve'ore b'shnei de Rav Chizda de Talmid Chaver dile hava. Va'ana nami Talmid Chaver de mar ana. So what he says is like this, that there's one statement that says, in other words, Rav Ashi was saying that I heard that Rav Hamnuna didn't give rulings. Okay, so what was the answer? Ravina said, no, there's a distinction here, because there's one statement that says that Rav Hamnuna did give rulings, and there's one that says he didn't. When didn't he? He didn't as long as Rav Huna was alive, because Rav Huna was actually his teacher. Rav Chizda was more of his colleague. He learned some from him, but he was a Talmid Chaver. Talmid Chaver would seems to mean, according to the Mefarshim, either a Talmid Chaver means a person who taught you something. In other words, you're a Talmid Chaver if someone taught you something but wasn't really your teacher. They taught you something. So you're partially subordinate to them, but really you're on the same level. Just that they educated you. Let's say they taught you, let's say you're equally qualified in halakha, but they taught you to be a mohel. Or they taught you some subject that you didn't know. So then you're a Talmid Chaver. You're their Talmid, but you're also their Chaver. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation means that Talmid Chaver is that you started out as a Talmid, but you became so great, you reached the level of the Rav. So now you're a Talmid Chaver. But either way, the point is that Rav Chizda and Rav Hamnuna were on more of an equal footing. So that's why, even though Rav Chizda was alive, even though in certain ways Rav Hamnuna was subordinate to Rav Ashi, to Rav Chizda, either because Rav Chizda had taught him some things, or because Rav Chizda was actually his teacher, but he reached his level, he got to his level. So he was a colleague in some respect. That's why he was able to give rulings while Rav Chisda was alive. But when Rav Huna was alive, he wouldn't have given rulings because Rav Huna was his absolute master. He never would have even thought to give any rulings during that time. So what Rav Ashi is saying to Ravina, Ravina is saying to Rav Ashi is, and I too, va'ana nami talmid chaver demar ana, I am also a talmid chaver of yours. In other words, which either means you only taught me some area, I'm only subordinate to you in some area, but I'm your colleague in other areas, or it means I was your student, but now I've achieved the level that I'm on equal footing with you.
Ravina said that to Rav Ashi.
Ravina is saying that's Rav Ashi now. So, and it makes sense actually that it would mean that, because you see that even when Rav Ashi speaks to Ravina, he says, Mar, mai ta'ama avad mar hachi. Why did the master do this? Implying that he respects him as being on an equal or greater level than he is. So that he says the reason is because we're on somewhat of an equal footing. So Amar Rava says, that a rabbinical student, a Tzurva mi Rabbanan, is allowed to look at the knife for himself. He doesn't have to go. In other words, if you're a shochet, a lay person, then you have to go to the Chacham and show him the knife. But if you are a Talmid Chacham yourself doing shechita, you can look at it yourself. If you're just slaughtering for yourself, because you're not doing anything official, you're not doing anything for the community that needs the Rav's, the Chacham's imprimatur, and also you know the stuff. You're a Talmid Chacham. So if you're slaughtering for yourself, you don't have to show it to anybody else, the knife. Okay, so Ravina ikal mechuza. Ravina came to mechuza. Aite ushpezichne sakina. So the host that was taking care of his needs brought the knife, and he was showing him the knife. He was showing Ravina the knife. Amarle, Ravina said, Zil amtiel Rava. You should show it to Rava. Why? Because Rava was the Chacham of Mechoza. He said, don't show it to me. Show it to the real Chacham. Show it to the boss. So it's not an issue of who's smarter. It's an issue of who's the authority here. You shouldn't bring it to me. You should bring it to who the recognized authority is in this neighborhood. But Amarle said to him, Lo savar mar hadam amar Rava. But Rava himself said, Shurva mi Rabbanan chazel nafshe. He said, didn't Rava himself? Why should I bring the knife to Rava? Rava himself said that if you're a rabbi, you're allowed to look at the knife for your own slaughtering. So you don't have to show it to anybody else. And I'm showing it to you so I can make you your dinner. It's for you. So what does Ravina say? Interesting distinction. Anam mizban zevina. He said, I'm a customer here. So true that it's for me because I'm going to eat the food, right? I'm going to eat the meat. But it's not really for me because I'm just a paying customer. Really, it is for the business. In other words, it's for the inn or the hotel or whatever it is that is doing the slaughtering. So even though you're serving me, really the slaughtering is being done for your business. That's a commercial purpose. And you should really be showing it to Rava, who is the head chief rabbi of the town, not to me. Siman Zila, Lehani, Machlif, Ika, V'Yaakov. So these are simanim to remind us of what the next several statements, the order of the next several statements. It's a mnemonic to keep us, to be able to remember the order. So Rabbi Elazar me Hagronia, Rav Abba bar Tachlifa, Rabbi Elazar from Hagronia and Rav Abba bar Tachlifa, Ikleu lebe Rav Acha, brother Rav Ika. They came to the house of Rav Acha, the son of Rav Ika. Be'atre de Rav Achabar Yaakov, but they were in the locale of Rav Achabar Yaakov. Okay, Ba'e Rav Achabar de Rav Ika leme'ebad lehu iglat tilta. So what happened was that Rav Achab, the son of Rav Ika, wanted to make for them an iglat tilta, which there's difference of opinion about what this means, but what we know is it was a delicacy. Okay, because whenever in the Talmud it's mentioned as being like the finest thing you can serve somebody, like filet mignon. It's like, I don't know what would be the classic most gourmet meat dish that you would serve somebody?
Deli roll.
Tongue is the most expensive, that's for sure.
Deli roll is not so
deli
roll because there is a thing called turk and duck.
Deli roll.
In which they take turkey and they put it inside of a chicken.
Is it really?
Inside of a duck.
Deli roll is considered classy?
That was a big thing in DC.
Okay, well,
and it says Mishulashin.
I don't know from these things, but no, Rashi brings the two opinions. Right, so Rashi brings two things here. He says either it means something that was a third of its growth. In other words, it was up to a third of its lifespan. So that was considered an age where it was very tender, the meat was very good. Or it means the third to its mother. The third baby of the mother was considered to be the tastiest. Okay, so he rejects that interpretation. He goes with the one that it's a third third grown, but there are different interpretations. What we know is whatever it was the finest.
A lamb.
Right, it was the finest thing that you could serve, the classiest thing, caviar, whatever it is, the finest thing you could serve to the guest. And so they wanted to serve it to him. So so he was showing the knife to the rabbis who were assembled there. Amar lehu Rab Acha bar Tahlifa. So Rab Acha bar Tahlifa said to him, Lo lechosh le Saba. Shouldn't we be concerned about Saba? Shouldn't we be concerned about the elder here? Because remember, even though these rabbis were together and they were all at the house of Rav Acha bar Rav Ika, they were in the locale of Rav Acha bar Yaakov, who was an elder rabbi, who was the chacham of the town. The Marad Atra was around. Shouldn't we show him the knife? Amar lahu Rabbi Elazar Mehagronia. Rabbi Elazar Mehagronia said to them, Hachi Amar Rava said, Tzurva mi Rabbanan chazel nafshe. Rabbinical students are allowed to look, in other words, Talmidei Chachamim are allowed to look at their own knives and do slaughtering, and we're just doing this for our personal use. It's not commercial use, it's not public use, it's our personal use. So why do we have to bring it to the Chacham? We're Talmidei Chachamim. We don't need to. Chazeh v'yanash. It says that he looked at the knife himself, v'yanish, and he was punished. It doesn't tell us what the punishment was, but somehow there was a divine punishment visited upon him, because even though he was justified in bypassing the kavod of Rav Acha bar Yaakov, still he was punished. So the Gemara asks, Rabbi Elazar Mehagronia, V'yanash Rabbi Elazar Mehagronia. Rabbi Elazar ben Mehagronia was punished as a result of taking the initiative here and permitting them to look at the knife themselves and not to show it to the elder rabbi of the town. But didn't Rava say, didn't they have a halachic basis for doing that? They just said that Talmid Chacham, he can look at his own knife. He doesn't have to bring the knife to the head of the town. So why did he get in trouble for doing what was halachically justifiable? The problem was that there, once the issue came up, somebody raised the issue of the kavod of Rav Acha bar Yaakov, and he dismissed it. So that was disrespectful. In other words, if nobody had said anything and they had just gone about their business, they wouldn't have violated any halacha. But somebody brings up, hey, we should really show respect to Rav Acha bar Yaakov. And he says, we don't need to do that. Why do we need to go to him? We're Talmidei Chachamim. That was the part that was considered disrespectful, because the issue came up. Okay, so once the issue came up, they should address it. Alternatively, maybe he was punished because Shanei Rav Acha bar Yaakov de muflag. Maybe the fact is that Rav Acha bar Yaakov was an outstanding gedol ador. He was. It says harbe meod haya zaken v'chacham. Rashi says yes, maflig, not muflag, but the same thing. He was extremely old and wise. In other words, he was like having Yoda there. You don't. In Shanim and in Chokhmah. Yes.
Does this assume that the particular knowledge of the subject matter between the Talmid Chacham and the Rav of the community is the same?
They're assuming it's the same.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're not assuming that there's some knowledge issue here, but it was a kavod to say we're not going to go. It was considered to be an act of srara, like an act of authority, to do shechita for commercial purposes, because you're serving the community. So really the Rav of the town should inspect the knife. It was a kavod for him, not because we don't think that the Talmid Chacham knows how to do the shechita. Oh. So that's why if you're a Talmid Chacham for private purposes, you don't really have to go to the Chacham. But since they brought it up, or since maybe he's so distinguished, it was the right thing to do to go to him, even for personal reasons. So Amar Rava says, now we're talking about not making rulings in front of your Rav, but to separate somebody from a violation of Torah is permitted even right in front of your Rav. Ravina havayatev kamed Ravashi. Once upon a time, Ravina was sitting in front of Ravashi. He saw a person who was tying his animal to a dekel, to a palm tree on Shabbat. Now this wasn't an Isur Deoraita necessarily, but you're not allowed to utilize a tree on Shabbat. You're not allowed to tie an animal to a tree on Shabbat. Rama Bekala, he started screaming at him. Ravina started screaming at the man, Velo Ashkach and he didn't listen. Amar le lehevei gavra b'shamta. He said, may that person who's not listening to me and won't cease and desist from tying his animal to the tree be b'shamta, be in cherem. Okay, so he put him into cherem for disrespecting him by not listening. Amar le ki gavna mi mitchaza ke'afkeruta. So Ravina felt guilty because he reprimanded this person in front of his own teacher. Who are you to reprimand somebody in front of the teacher? You can't reprimand somebody because that's taking authority. Like, remember the story about the rabbi that you told me, that somebody told someone to be quiet, and he said, nobody tells anybody to be quiet in my synagogue, only me, remember? Yeah. Yeah, so it's the same thing. Right. Nobody tells people to be quiet but me.
It was just too late.
In the balcony or something. Yeah. Yes, it's the same idea. So he said, was that wrong what I did? He said to him, there's no wisdom, no understanding, and no advice against Hashem. Anytime there's a chilul Hashem, there's a desecration of God's name, we don't worry about the kavod harav, we don't worry about the honor of the teacher. So in a case where you see somebody actually violating halacha, there's nothing disrespectful, even if the teacher is there, about going over and telling them you can't do that. Making a ruling when a question comes, or holding forth on what you think the halacha is, you can't do that. But if you see somebody violating halacha, you don't say, we can't. It's the same thing as it said about in Masekhet Berachot. If you're in the bathroom and you see somebody doing something on Shabbat, you don't say, I can't talk about halacha in the bathroom, so I just have to let him do whatever he wants. No, you're allowed to, because you're separating somebody from doing something that's against halacha, and in that case, we don't worry about it. Other issues. Amar Rava says, "Befanav asur v'hayav mita, shelo befanav asur ve'en hayav mita." That when you're in the presence of the Rav, it's prohibited, and hayav mita. It's one who makes a ruling in the presence of the Rav is chayav mita, is liable to the death penalty. When he's not around, it's still prohibited, even if he's not physically present, to make a ruling as long as your Rav is alive. But and obviously this means without his permission. But v'yein chayav mita. But you're not chayav mita. That's the whole idea of smicha today. Today the smicha that we have is called heter hora'ah. That your teacher tells you that he permits you to give rulings in halacha. That's all that it means. So if he didn't give you that permission, you don't have a right to make a ruling, because anywhere in the world, who are you to make a ruling when your Rav is still alive? You should have to defer to him on everything. So, is it really true that even when your Rav is not around, that you're not liable to the death penalty? But it says in the Braita that Rabbi Eliezer says, Lo metu bnei Aaron ad shehoru halacha b'fnei Moshe Rabban. That what was the reason why the Nadav and Avihu died? It was because they made a halachic ruling in front of their teacher Moshe. My darush, what did they analyze? Because it says in the Torah that Bnei Aharon HaKohen, that the sons of Aharon should put fire on the altar. And what did they think to themselves? That even though divine fire comes down, it's still a mitzvah to bring fire from a human source. That's why they combined it with their own fire. So based on that ruling, they were chayav mitah. And what do you see? You see from that even though, in other words, in that case, right, they didn't ask him, they didn't defer to him, they came up with their own ruling, and yet it wasn't directly in front of him necessarily. And furthermore, we learned that there was a certain student that the point is not over yet. So let's just read the whole thing. And there was one student of Rabbi Eliezer who ruled on a halacha in front of him. Amar Rabbi Eliezer said, Le'imma shalom ishto, to Imma shalom his wife, Tameh ani im yotzi ze shnato, I will be surprised if this person lives the rest of the year. V'lo hotzi shnato, and he didn't live the rest of the year. Amra lo, she said to him, Naviata, are you a prophet? Amar la, he said, Lo navi anochi v'lo ben navi anochi, I am not a navi and I am not the son of a navi, v'lo ben navi anochi, elakach mikublani, but this is what I received as a tradition, kol amoreh halacha b'fnei rabo, anybody who rules on halacha in the presence of their teacher, chayav mitah, will be liable to the death penalty, and therefore I knew that he wasn't going to live out the year. So therefore, and Amar Rabbi Bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Oto Talmid Yehuda ben Gorya Shemo, that student's name was Yehuda ben Gorya, V'haya rachog menu shalosh parsaot, and he was 3 parsaot away. That's 12 mil, 3 parsaot away from his teacher when he made the ruling. So what do you see? Even if you're not in the presence of the teacher, forget about Nadav and Avihu, who maybe he wasn't right there, but he was basically right there because Moshe Rabbeinu was nearby. Okay, but this student was 3 parsaot away. That's pretty far. And yet, making the ruling, he still died from it. from making the ruling. So you see that even if it's not bifanav, it's not allowed. The Gemara answers, no. Bifanav hava. He definitely must have been in his presence, because otherwise how can we sustain the statement of Rava before? Rava said that if you do it shelo bifanav, you're not chayav mitah. You're not going to be liable to the death penalty. The Gemara says, "V'harachok mimenu shalosh parsaot kama," but it says that he was 3 parsaot away. How can you say that he was in the presence of his teacher when he made the ruling? It's not true. It says he was 3 parsaot away. No. According to you, why does it mention his name and the name of his father? In other words, it's not telling you where he was when he made the ruling. It's telling you where he lived and what his name was. Why did they mention what his name was and where he was? Not to tell you that he wasn't in the actual presence of his Rav when he made the ruling, but to tell you his name and his father's name and where he lived, so you know that it was a real person and it really happened. And it wasn't just a mashal. It wasn't just a story that they were telling to illustrate a point. So what's the point? What's the idea here? The idea is that if it's bifanav, if it's in the presence of the Rav, then it's no good. Then it's chayav mitah. If it's not in the presence of the Rav, more than 3 parsaot away for sure, then it's going to be still prohibited, but not chayav mitah. Okay, that's the idea. So Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Chia bar Abba said that Rabbi Yochanan said, "Kol amar halacha b'fnei Rabbo ra'oi lahakisho nachash." That anybody who rules on halacha in front of his teacher, he's worthy of being bitten by a snake. Shenemar, as it says, "Vayan Elihu ben Barachel habuzi," as it says in the pasuk in Eov, that at the end of the conversation, so the youngest person comes along, and this is Elihu, and he comes Vayomar, and he says, Tza'ir ani liyamim. So he's the one who's the youngest one, and etc. Al ken zachalti. Therefore, I was afraid. In other words, because everyone here is older than me, they're like my teachers. I was afraid to speak. And it says further, and zachalti means I was afraid. Uchtiv im chamat zochale afar, with those who slither in the dust. Okay, so what is that? It's talking about snakes. So zachalti, what was he afraid of? What was he worried about? He was worried about being bitten by a snake. In other words, because he would be contradicting his teachers, because he saw the elders as his teachers. So he was concerned about contradicting their words. Ze'iri amar Rabbi Hanina. Ze'iri said that Rabbi Hanina said, Nikra choteh, that he's called a choteh, a sinner. Shneimar ubelibitza fanti imratecha lemanu echet alach. That I kept your words in my heart, so I wouldn't sin to you. In other words, even though I knew what the right thing was, I didn't say anything. Belibitza fanti imratecha, so that I wouldn't sin. What would the sin be of speaking? Right. That's from Alphabeta, right? So what does it mean? I kept the words in my heart so I wouldn't sin. It means I didn't say something in front of my teacher to contradict him or to say a ruling, even though I knew what the halacha was. To say, or even if it's not contradicting him, I didn't answer. Even though I knew what the Torah was, I knew what the halacha was, I didn't say anything in the presence of my teacher so that I wouldn't sin. Rav Hamnuna showed a contradiction. It says in one pasuk that in my heart I guarded your words so that I wouldn't sin. And then in another pasuk it says, Uchtiv bisarti tzedek b'kahal rav, that I told forth tzedek. In other words, I spoke forth the truth in the community, in the great community. So, which one is it? Is it keeping it?
It's bringing about the problem that, sometimes that puts you in a very precarious situation where maybe the rav is not actually saying something that needs to be said, right? And so you feel the obligation to say.
Well, that's the thing. But they said that before. In other words, right? In one case, it said when you're actually stopping somebody from violating the Torah, you have to say. Right? But that's what we talked about before. But if you're just giving a halachic ruling, somebody comes with a question, say, ask the rabbi. I don't want to say.
It's not always clear cut.
Right.
I think that was the point of David saying, right after that, it's like, I don't know what to do.
Right. Right. So now that we have a contradiction, is it good to declare or is it good to keep it to yourself? So he says, Lo kashi, no problem. Kan bizman she'ira ha'ya'iri kayam. Kan bizman she'en ira ha'ya'iri kayam. That when did David HaMelech say, I'm going to keep the Torah to myself? That was when his teacher, Ira HaYa'iri, was still alive. But when his teacher, Ira HaYa'iri, was no longer alive, then he said, I'm going to declare the halacha. Amar Rabbi Abba bar Zavda. Rabbi Abba Bar said, anybody who gives all of his matanot, all of his gifts to only one kohen, he doesn't spread the wealth, so to speak. That person brings ra'av, he brings famine to the world. In other words, a person should give to various, this is also true for tzedakot probably. You should give to various tzedakot, not just to one. Not just one kohen, not just one tzedakah. And where do we get this from? Shene'emar, as we see in the pasuk, Ira Ya'iri haya kohen le David. That Ira Yairi was the Kohen of David, meaning to say that was the Kohen that he patronized. That was the Kohen he gave all of his matanot to. And you could imagine that that the amount of matanot that a king gives is probably huge. So he was probably very happy about that. The Davidu dehava Kohen, al malo. In other words, for that means that he was the Kohen of David, not for everyone else. In other words, David exclusively took care of this one Kohen, and nobody else took care of him, and he didn't take care of anybody else. In other words, David didn't spread the wealth to anybody else, nor did this Kohen receive from anybody else. And that's what brings Rav. And in the very next pasuk, I misread it. It's a question. Does this mean that he was a Kohen of David, but he wasn't a Kohen for everybody else? What does it mean it was a Kohen for David? What it means is, it means that he would give him all of his gifts. And right after that it says, that there was a famine in the days of David. So from the fact that David had an exclusive Kohen, that he gave all of his matanot, he gave all of his terumah, etc., to this one Kohen, that caused Ra'av, that caused a famine to come to the land. Now, an interesting question that Tosafot raises is that how can he be Ira Ya'iri? Ya'iri means that he comes from Ya'ir, he comes from Shevet Menashe. How could Ya'iri be a Kohen? So one explanation possibly is that his mother was from that Shevet, but his father was a Kohen, but he was called after his mother's lineage. Or he says the pshuto shel mikra, really the pshat of the pasuk is Kohen means a servant or an officer. It doesn't necessarily mean, like it says also Bnei David Kohanim hayu, that the children of David were Kohanim, the sons of David. It doesn't mean that they were Kohanim in the Beit HaMikdash. It means to say that they were servants or officers in his court. So he says that's really the pshat, but we're taking it to be a Kohen. And the point is that because he exclusively patronized one Kohen, that caused a Ra'av, that caused a famine to come to the land. Rabbi Eliezer says, Moridino tomigdulato, that the person will be lowered from his greatness. Okay, now Rashi explains, here we are back to the subject of somebody, not who gives all of their matanot to one Kohen, but somebody who rules on halacha in front of their teacher will be lowered from his position of greatness. Shnemar, as we see. We find that when the Jews came back from the war against Midian, Elazar Kohen goes out and tells them to do tevilat kelim and to do hechsher kelim. All of the vessels that they brought back from the war, they had to make them kasher and they had to immerse them for tevilat kelim. Even though he said it to them, he explained to them, my father's brother received this commandment. I didn't receive this commandment. In other words, when Elazar Kohen went and told the people to do hechsher kelim, he explained to them, Asher tzivah Hashem et Moshe. This is what Hashem commanded Moshe. In other words, he didn't take credit for it. He didn't say, I'm the one who is responsible for this halacha. He said that it came from Hashem. And yet, he still was punished. How so? Because Yehoshua was told that you will always have to ask questions from Elazar Kohen. And we never find in the Navi that Yehoshua actually consulted with Elazar. What does that show you? That he would have been a halachic, he would have been a spiritual authority for Yehoshua, but he lost the opportunity because he took upon himself the position of authority to start instructing the people even when Moshe Rabbeinu was around, instead of going to Moshe Rabbeinu and saying to him, you should teach the people about Tevilat Kelim, because according to the Midrash, Moshe Rabbeinu forgot to teach them about kashering the stuff that they brought from Midian, because he was so worried about the fact that they kept the people from Midian alive that they weren't supposed to. He forgot to tell them about the other halachot, and so Elazar really should have gone to Moshe and told him, Rabbi Umori, you have to go and teach them also the halachot of Hechsher Kelim. Instead, he stood up and did it himself, and therefore he lost the opportunity to be the spiritual authority in the days of Yehoshua. Amar let Rabbi Levi says, Kola demotiv milakame Rabbe. Anybody who answers a word in front of their teacher, Azil lish'ol belo valad. He's going to go to the pit without a child. In other words, go to the end of his days. He's never going to have a child. Shene'emar, as it says, Vayan Yehoshua ben Nun misharet Moshe b'bechura vayomar. As it says, Yehoshua ben Nun responded to Moshe. Okay, and Yehoshua ben Nun is described as misharet Moshe b'bechurav, who among the young people was the one who served Moshe. Okay, or it could mean that he served him from his youth. But either way, it means that he was the servant of Moshe Rabbeinu, and the assistant of Moshe Rabbeinu. And he said, "Adoni Moshe Kilaem." When Eldad and Medad are proclaiming prophecy in the camp, Yehoshua goes to Moshe and tells him what to do. He says, "Really, you should put them in jail. You should imprison these people. Who are these people?" Uchtiv, and it says Nun beno Yehoshua beno. In Divrei Yamim, when it counts the lineage of Yehoshua, it says Nun his son, meaning his grandfather's son was Nun, and Yehoshua was Yehoshua bin Nun. However, it never mentions Yehoshua having a son. Yehoshua never had a son because of the disrespect to Moshe Rabbeinu. He's telling him what to do. He shouldn't have told him what to do.
This morning they said that Rashi said that he had daughters.
Yeah, he had daughters, yeah. That is true. Upligad Rabbi Abba bar Papa. And Rabbi Abba bar Papa disagrees with this. Amar Rabbi Abba bar Papa, Lo ne'anash Yehoshua el bishvil shebitel et Yisrael laila achad mipiryav rivya. It wasn't because of his intervention with Moshe that Yehoshua lost the opportunity to have sons. What? What about that? That was Yehoshua.
Because of that, they didn't have a night of
No, that's not why. No. So it wasn't because of intervening with Moshe. It was because he wasted one night. He prevented the Jews one night from having Piryav Rivya, being able to live with their wives and have relations with their wives. Because in advance of the war on Yericho, Yehoshua has this vision where he sees the angel, Uchtiv, and he says, the Malach says to Yehoshua, Vayomer lo ki ani sartzav Hashem atavati. He says, I am the captain of the army of Hashem, and I have come now. And according to the Midrash, also mentioned in Masekhet Megillah, this was a criticism that Yehoshua was in trouble with the Malach for something. Amar lo, he said to him, Emesh bitaltem tamid shel ben arba'im. So the Malach said to Yehoshua ben Nun, yesterday you forgot to do the afternoon korban. V'achshav bitaltem talmud Torah. And now you've forgotten to do Talmud Torah. Al eze mehen bata. And so Yehoshua asked him, which one are you coming to criticize me for? Amar lo, he said, atabati, I've come for what you're doing right now. Meaning the fact that right now you aren't learning Torah. Because what did Yehoshua do? They were preparing to attack Yericho. He had the people in battle formation that night. So instead of going back to the camp, he had the soldiers and everybody surrounding Yericho. And he was out there trying to strategize about what to do with Yericho. So he actually prevented them from learning Torah, and he prevented them also from being with their wives that night, because they were in battle formation with the Aron out of its normal place in the center of the camp.
He was planning for war.
Yeah. So miyad vayelech Yehoshua balaylahu b'toch ha'emek. The other version of this is vayalen Yehoshua balaylahu b'toch ha'emek. So that's what it says in Masechet Megillah. But the correct pasuk is actually vayelech Yehoshua balaylahu b'toch ha'emek. That he went to the valley that night. What is the valley? Va'amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says melamed shehalach be'omka shel halacha. That he walked into the depth of halacha that night. In other words, he studied, because the Malach said you did two things wrong. You neglected to do the korban of the afternoon, and you neglected to study Torah. And so he said, which one is the worst? He said, the fact that you're not studying Torah right now. So Yehoshua went and studied Torah. That's what it says. Now, Ugmiriam, we have a tradition to call Sharon Ushchina Shrugin Shlobim Koman Asurim Tashmish Amita, and we know that as long as the Aron and the divine presence are not in their proper place, it's prohibited to engage in marital relations. And since he had the Aron outside of its proper place because it was in battle formation together with the soldiers surrounding Yericho, therefore nobody could have marital relations at that time, and therefore he held everybody back from one night of being with their wives, and therefore he lost the opportunity to have a son. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Inya. Rav Shmuel bar Inya said. And according to the corrected version, where does it go? It tells you that it's actually what? Avya, not Inya. Mishmei Rav, in the name of Rav, Gadol Talmud Torah yoter mihakravat tamidin. Damar le atabati. You see from this that study of Torah is greater than bringing korbanot, because the two sins that Yoshua did, he asked him which one was worse, and he told him the worst one was not that you neglected to bring the korban tamid, but that you neglected to study Torah. Amar Rav Brona said that Rav said, Kol yashen bekil'ah she'ish v'ishto shruyin ba alav ha'katuv omer neshe'ami tigareshun mibeit hanugeh. That it says that the women of my people you have driven out from the house of their pleasure. In other words, what does it mean? If you stay in a place, in a room, bekil'ah, anybody who sleeps in a room where a husband and wife are sleeping, okay? In other words, preventing them from having intimacy, we say you're driving women out from the house of their enjoyment. In other words, you're preventing men and women from being together intimately. Avamar Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef said that it should say, Lo nitzrecha. This is not necessary, according to the Bach, it should say. That it should say, Lo nitzrecha. Ela, that it's only necessary to tell you this in a case be'ishto nida, that even with ishto nida, our girsa has afilu be'ishto nida, even if the wife is in nida, she's in the period of time where she's not allowed to have relations with her husband, still you shouldn't be in the room with them. Okay, and Rav Yosef is saying that's the only reason we really need that teaching, otherwise it would be obvious. Rava says, no, on the contrary, if you stay in the room with the husband and wife and the wife is nida, you're doing a mitzvah, you're preventing them from doing a sin. So the Gemara says, Velohi, but that's not true. Man nitare. Who was guarding them up till now? In other words, normally when you're home with your wife, you don't have any shomer making sure that you don't do anything that you're not supposed to do. So why should this guy take it upon himself to sleep in the same room as the husband and wife to make sure that they're not doing anything? That's not necessary. It's not a mitzvah to do that. There was a certain mavoy, there was a certain community in which a guy by the name of Lachman Baristak, which already sounds like a sinister type of name, okay, lived there, and he was a non-Jew. Amrulay, they said to him, Ogerlan Rishutach, please remember, we learned that if a non-Jew lives in the courtyard with the Jews, they have to rent his property from him in order to make an Eruvei Chatzerot, or in order to make a Shitufei Mevoot. So he said, Lo Ogerlo, he refused to give them to rent it to them. Atu Amrulei Labaye, they went to Abaye and said, what the heck are we going to do? This non-Jew is a holdout, we can't rent it from him, and therefore, since there's a non-Jew living here and we can't rent it from him, we can't make an Eruvei Chatzerot, and we're stuck. So Abaye came up with a novel solution. He said to them, Zilu batilu rishutaychu legabe chad, havei yachid b'mkom nochri, v'yachid b'mkom nochri lo asar. Here's a solution. We remember the concept of bitul rishut. You're allowed to nullify your right in the chatzer to somebody else. So let all the Jews nullify their rights to the chatzer to one person. Everybody give their rights to one person. Now what do we have? One person living in the courtyard with the one non-Jew. And we said the halacha follows Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov that one person, one Jew with one non-Jew, it's no problem. It's only two Jews with a non-Jew that's a problem. So then we won't have an issue. Now the one question that's raised by the Mefarshim is, what do you gain from that? Because if everybody nullifies their reshut to the one guy, the only thing that you have now is that the one guy can bring things in and out of his house and the courtyard. That's the only thing you're really going to gain. You're not going to gain anything beyond that. Or that he might be able to carry, let's say, from the chatzer, from the courtyard, into the mavot. But you're not really going to gain anything halachically beyond that. Now Tosafot says, well, the other thing you might gain, but that's worth it, better one person than nobody. Okay, that's one possibility. The other possible answer, in other words, he'll be able to move around in the chatzer, he'll be able to do what he needs to do. The other possible answer is that Tosafot says you can switch the bitul on Shabbat. In other words, everyone's mivatel to Jonathan now. Okay, now he can do what he wants. Now everyone's mivatel to Barnaby, including Jonathan. We'll all be mivatel to him. As long as there's only one person allowed to move around at any given time, you can change mid-Shabbat. And therefore everybody can be able to do what they need to do. So that's one possibility. That's a long Tosafot here where he discusses how, what do you really gain from this whole thing at the bottom of Samach Gimel Amud Bet going into Samach Daled Amud Aleph. A very, very long Tosafot there. Now, so this is a nice solution. Amrulay, they said to him, but midi hu ta'ama ela de la shechiach de daireh v'hacha hakadaireh. that remember, what is the reason why only one Jew living with one non-Jew in a courtyard doesn't have to make an Eruvei Chatzerot? Because we said it's la shachiach. It's not common. It's not common that one Jew will live with a non-Jew with no other Jews around. But here, that wouldn't apply. In other words, you're utilizing that halacha by everybody submitting themselves to one of the Jews. So you're making them all one in that way. And then it's like one person living with the one non-Jew. But wait a second, the reason why one Jew living with one non-Jew doesn't require an Eruv is because it's unusual for one Jew to live with one non-Jew. But here, we're all living together. We're not really one person. We're just giving him the rights to the courtyard. So it should be viewed as not an uncommon situation, as the common situation. Just like the same as when two Jews are living with one non-Jew. We shouldn't be able to use a double legal fiction like that. Oh, we're all going to subordinate ourselves to Jonathan, and now Jonathan's just one person living with the non-Jew, and we're not here. It's not true. It's common. So he answered them, no. That Amar lahu kol bitulei reshutayu gabe chad miltad l'shechichahi or miltad l'shechicha lo gazru barabanan. No. Now it's an unusual case for a different reason. It's not an unusual case because there's only one Jew living with one non-Jew or living among non-Jews. That would be unusual. And there, the rabbis wouldn't impose their gezerah. But this is also unusual. Why is it unusual? Because it's unusual for all the Jews in a chatzer to give over their rights to one person. So it's also an unusual case. And we can also say that the rabbis didn't make the gezerah of making an eruv or of sechirut, of renting from the non-Jew, in a case where everybody is mivatel to one person. Because it's also an unusual case. So the rabbis didn't impose the decree. Azal Rav Huna Brei de Rav Yoshua. So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yoshua, went Amra lishmata kamed Rava, and he tattletaled to Rava and told him what Abaye said, which happens very often because Abaye and Rava either are Amrei Ravayu, either they're saying things together or they're arguing. So he tattletaled on him. Amar he said to him, Im ken bitalta Torat Eruv me'otom avoy. According to this, you're basically undermining the concept of Eruv from this entire place because you're getting around it. You're pulling the carpet out from under them. So the Gemara says, Dima arvei. Maybe they can just make an eruv symbolically, even though it doesn't count. Yomiru eruv mo'il bimkom nochrei. But then people will think that it really worked. They'll think that the eruv worked, even with the non-Jew there. Okay, fine. Demachrezinan acharazta. They'll announce, demachrezinan. So let us announce to everybody that really this eruv doesn't work. We're just doing it symbolically so people don't forget the concept of eruv. But the real mechanism that's working is that everybody is subordinating their rights in the chatzer to the one person. So acharazta ledardike. Will an announcement serve the children? In other words, the children who grow up and see that there's a non-Jew there, he hasn't rented his space out to anybody, and we're doing an eruv every week, they're going to think that you can do an eruv with a non-Jew there. They're not going to understand the mechanism. Rather, Ela Amar Rava gives a different suggestion. Lezel chad minayhu likaravle. This is brilliant. He uses a psychological approach. He uses a pragmatic solution, not a halachic solution. He says, become friends with the guy. Let somebody become friends with this non-Jew, Lachman, whatever his name is, Baristak. Ve'lish'ol minei duchta, and ask him for a place on his property. Okay, ve'lenach be'midi, and where he can place something of his own. Hey, Lachman, my buddy, we had beers last night. Could I put my bicycle, on your driveway? I just want to store my bicycle on your driveway. Would that be okay? Sure, we're friends now. We had a beer summit. No problem. So he says, and then what happens? Then, dehavale kischiro ulkito. Va'amar Rav Yehuda amar Shmuel afilu sechiro ulkito va'afilu lekito noten eruvo v'dayo. So basically, what's the answer? How does this work? You become friends with Lachman. He lets you borrow some space in his house or some space on his property, or you can store your stuff. Now you become like a Baal Habayit with him of his property. Now that you're a Baal Habayit with him in his property, you can join the Eruv, no problem. Forget about Lachman. He doesn't have a complete ownership anymore because you, by becoming friends with him, were able to get a small partial ownership of part of his property. And now you can join the Eruv, and he's what do you call it? made obsolete now. His role is obsolete. That's how Rashi interprets it. Rashi interprets it that what happened here is you're like schiro lekito. Schiro means a worker that's hired for a year. Lekito is a worker that's hired for just for the season, for the harvest season. And the halacha is that a schiro lekito, somebody who is a hireling or a temporary worker, can participate in the eruv and remove the obligation to rent from the non-Jew. That's how Rashi. This is Rashi's interpretation. Rashi's interpretation is that if you work for the non-Jew, okay, or you're somehow a resident with the non-Jew because you're a resident worker, even a temporary worker, even if you're just there for the season, even if you're just there for the year, because you have a partial residence with the non-Jew, because you're working for him, you can now, as a Jew, join in the eruv, and you no longer need to rent from the non-Jew. He is rendered obsolete because there's a Jew living in his house. There's a Jew sharing in his property rights, even if it's temporary, even if it's only for a few months, and therefore he can join in the eruv with the Jews, and the non-Jew is not an issue. That's how Rashi interprets it. Other Rishonim and the way that the Psak Halacha goes is differently. That it's not that having a Jew as part of the household of the non-Jew makes the non-Jew obsolete. It's that anybody who is part of the staff of the non-Jew can rent on the non-Jew's behalf. Can rent out the space on the non-Jew's behalf. In other words, how does it work here? Rashi interprets it that it works that the Jew becomes part of the household of the non-Jew, and then because he's part of the household of the non-Jew, he can just join in the eruv as a Jew.
Wait,
the other... one second.
Rashi's saying he can rent, in other words...
Forget the rent.
That he can rent?
No. Forget the renting. Forget the renting. According to Rashi, there's no renting, because what happens is Matthias goes, he's a worker for Lachman, or he's a friend of Lachman, and he got some of his property, he borrowed some of his space. Now it's like you're a Baal HaBayit in his house. You're a part of his bayit, you're part of his household, so now it's a Jewish house too. Partially. And therefore, there's no non-Jewish house in the neighborhood, so you can just join the eruv, no problem. Okay? That's how Rashi interprets it. The other Rishonim say, no, that's not how it works. What it means that schiro lekito, that the worker of the non-Jew is good enough for the eruv, is that if you work for the non-Jew, you can represent the non-Jew in the rental. So that means that Lachman doesn't want to rent you his space. But now that Matthias has part of Lachman's property rights, because he got him to give him a piece of his property, I can go to Matthias and say, would you, on behalf of Lachman, please rent me the space you have in the Chatzer? Even in reality, it wouldn't happen. Yeah. And you're allowed to do it. Okay? Or if you work for him, if you're schiro lekito, if you worked in his household, you're his butler, you're his worker in his field, whatever it is. Let's say June. I go to Nida and say to Nida, I'd like to rent the space that Sammy has in the hallways, and it would be no problem because she works for him, and therefore she's part of his household.
It would be no problem.
But he's Jewish. I wouldn't.
Right.
But I'm just giving an example. Somebody has a household staff.
That's an assumption.
It's an assumption. It's a leniency. It's a leniency. But that's why when we let's say in an apartment.
Doesn't have an authority.
Of course not. No. Right. No. Of course not. Of course not. Yeah, I don't know if I want to record that though about something personal, but
one time a telephone company or Yellow Pages, not the main one, the other one. Mm-hmm. They called at night. We would like you to switch to our company, and there was a worker there, no authority, no nothing. Says yes. They switch. It cost me a few $100. And he told me, I have even proof. Listen, and I listened to one of the workers that makes... One
of the workers just answered the phone, right?
It doesn't have any authorities.
Right. We have it.
A few years ago, people used to switch phone without permission when they stopped.
Right, they stopped doing that, yeah. Well, but here, it's just symbolic, the rental. So it's different. So that's why even the worker of the non-Jew can rent for him. So that's a big machloket, though, because according to Rashi, it has to be a Jew that becomes the worker of the non-Jew, or that gets some space given to him from the non-Jew. So now the Jew can say that he doesn't have any of his own property rights because I share it with him, and by joining in the Eruv, I make him obsolete. We don't need to rent from him. Whereas the other Rishonim say, no, it doesn't. It's not that you make him obsolete. It's we're trying to find a way to do the rental. So what do we need to do? We need to infiltrate his staff with somebody who will be willing to do the rental without his knowledge. So even though they don't have the real authority to do so, since it's symbolic, and since it's a symbolic thing. So that's why, for example, in the apartment buildings, what do? You go to the doorman, you go to the worker. He doesn't really have the ability to rent, but because he works for the Baal HaBayit, therefore, since it's only a symbolic rental to begin with, we're allowed to do it that way.